The red stain on my backseat upholstery never completely washed out, no matter how many cleaning products I tried. It reminds me daily of my near-fatal mistake, stopping for the man with the broken-down car on that empty stretch of highway. His smile seemed so genuine when I pulled over. His gratitude so convincing when I unlocked my doors. What I didn't know then was that he had disabled his own vehicle deliberately, and the roadside camera footage would later show he'd let 6 other cars pass before choosing mine. In his apartment, police would find my photo already printed out, my daily route mapped, and a freshly dug grave waiting on his family's abandoned property. How many subtle warnings do we ignore before making the one decision that nearly ends everything? Before we continue this true story, your likes and comments help this channel grow and remain sustainable. Take a moment to drop where you're listening from in the comments section below, then settle in. On Dark Choices, we explore how ordinary decisions lead people into extraordinary danger, one choice at a time. Before that night on Route 16, my life ran on predictable rails. I taught English at Westlake High School, graded papers on weekends, and visited my mother at Sunny Pines Assisted Living every Wednesday and Sunday. The divorce from Mark had been finalized just 6 months earlier, leaving me alone in the small ranch house we once shared, now saddled with both a mortgage and Mum's ever-increasing medical bills. "You need to start locking your doors, Olivia," my friend Rachel had lectured me just weeks before. She'd stopped by unannounced and walked right in, finding me grading essays at the kitchen table. Seriously, a single woman living alone can't be this trusting. I'd laughed it off. This is Millfield, not Chicago. Nothing happens here. That trustfulness was a family trait. My father had picked up hitchhikers my entire childhood. Despite my mother's protests, "You can't turn your back on someone who needs help," he'd insisted. That's not how we were raised. He'd died still believing in the fundamental goodness of strangers, never once encountering someone who took advantage of his kindness. My daily commute took me down Route 16, a 2-lane highway connecting Millfield to the slightly larger town of Glenwood, where Westlake High stood surrounded by cornfields. The stretch between towns had few streetlights and even fewer houses, particularly the 5-mile segment that cut through Archer Woods. Most days, I barely noticed the isolation, my mind occupied with lesson plans or audiobooks. Looking back, there were signs I should have heeded, small disturbances that seemed insignificant individually, but formed a pattern I was too blind to see. The hang-up calls that started coming to my classroom phone after school hours, the sense of being watched while unloading groceries in my driveway, mail that went missing, only to appear a day later, slightly wrinkled, as if read and replaced, a student mentioning they'd seen someone who wasn't me driving my car on a Saturday, when I was certain it had been in my garage. "You're being paranoid," I told myself. This is post-divorce anxiety talking. My brother James had warned me about this when he called from his military posting overseas. Divorce messes with your head, Liv. You start seeing threats everywhere because your trust got shattered. Don't let Mark's cheating turn you into someone who suspects everyone. I'd taken his advice to heart, perhaps too much, when a shopping bag disappeared from my front step. I blamed forgetfulness rather than theft. When my garden gate was found open 3 mornings in a row, I faulted the wind instead of an intruder. My mother noticed the change in me during our Sunday visits. "You're too trusting now," she said, her mind clear despite her physical frailty. "It's like you're overcorrecting, trying to prove Mark didn't break you." "I'm being normally cautious, Mom," I'd insisted. During our last visit before that night, she had grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "There's a difference between kindness and carelessness, Olivia. Your father was kind, but he was never careless. He trusted his instincts." "My instincts are fine," I assured her. What I couldn't possibly know then was that while I sat holding my mother's hand, someone was sitting in their car in the Sunny Pines parking lot, noting the exact time of my departure, adding it to a meticulous log of my movements that already filled several notebooks, that my instincts had been deliberately tested and measured over weeks through a series of orchestrated encounters designed to assess my helpfulness to strangers, that I had already been selected, my patterns mapped, my tendencies documented, that I wasn't randomly chosen on Route 16. I was hunted. The rain started halfway through my evening parent-teacher conferences, a gentle drizzle that became a downpour by the time I left Westlake High at 8:40 p.m. The parking lot had emptied, leaving my blue Honda sitting alone under flickering security lights. I hurried across the wet asphalt, already dreading the dark drive home. Route 16 was deserted that night, raindrops catching in my headlights like falling silver. I turned the radio up, some late-night DJ playing melancholy songs that matched the weather. The windshield wipers beat a hypnotic rhythm that almost made me miss the hazard lights, blinking weakly through the rain. A car had pulled onto the narrow shoulder, just before the Archer would stretch, its hood raised. A figure in a dark raincoat stood beside it, illuminated momentarily in my headlights. Something about the scene triggered a moment of hesitation, a fleeting thought to keep driving, but I didn't. I pulled over about 20 feet ahead, watching in my rearview mirror as the person approached, a man in business, attire beneath the open raincoat, looking remarkably put together despite the weather, clean-shaven, early 40s perhaps, with the kind of generic handsomeness that registers as trustworthy, without being particularly memorable. Lowered my window halfway. Car trouble. Yes, unfortunately. His voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place. Possibly Midwestern. It just died completely. I've tried calling for help, but there's no cell service in this stretch. I checked my own phone. He was right. No bars. I'd be incredibly grateful for a ride to the next town. He continued, there's a service station just off the Glenwood exit that's open late. I know it's an imposition, especially in this weather. I hesitated, my mother's warning briefly surfacing before being washed away by rain and ingrained politeness. Of course, I heard myself say. Hop in. You're a lifesaver, he said, jogging around to the passenger side. Literally saving me from pneumonia out here. He settled into the seat, bringing the smell of rain and something faintly chemical that I assumed was cologne. Up close, his suit looked expensive, slightly damp at the shoulders, but otherwise immaculate. I'm Michael, he said, offering his hand. Michael Reeves. Olivia, I replied, shaking it briefly before returning my hand to the steering wheel. Olivia Kendall. Olivia, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Thank you for stopping. Not many people would these days. I pulled back onto Route 16, windshield wipers struggling against the downpour. What happened to your car? Electrical system, I think. Everything just shut down while I was driving. He sighed, sounding genuinely frustrated. I should have replaced it months ago, but work's been so busy. What do you do? I asked, falling into the easy rhythm of polite conversation. Financial consulting. I manage investment portfolios for a firm in Glenwood. He turned slightly in his seat. What about you? Let me guess from all those papers in your backseat. Teacher. I nodded, surprised. High school English, I thought. So, my sister's a teacher too, up in Springfield. The papers never end, she says. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a wallet, flipping it open to show a family photo. A woman with 2 young children smiled back. Your family? I asked. My sister and her kids, he confirmed. I'm not married myself. Too much traveling. For work. Something about seeing the photo relaxed me further. People with family photos aren't usually psychopaths, I thought. What I didn't know then was that the wallet had been carefully prepared for exactly this purpose. The sister was actually a woman whose identity he had stolen months earlier. The children in the photo weren't hers either, but pulled from a stock image website. This prop, like everything about Michael Reeves, was meticulously crafted to lower defenses and create false connection. I also didn't know that he had deliberately disabled his own vehicle by removing a specific fuse and cutting the backup electrical system, that he had allowed 6 cars to pass by before mine arrived, that upon seeing my blue Honda, he had smiled and whispered, "Right on schedule," before positioning himself to appear as a stranded motorist, that in the trunk of his disabled car sat a pre-packed bag containing zip ties, duct tape, chemical restraints, and 3 different knives, each serving a specific purpose in what he called his acquisition process, that I wasn't offering a ride to a stranger. I was welcoming my hunter into my car. "So you teach at Westlake? I have a client whose daughter goes there," Michael said as we drove through the rain. "Bright girl, wants to study journalism. Maybe she's in one of your classes." "What's her name?" I asked, navigating a curve where water had pooled across the asphalt. Megan Sullivan, I think." I nodded, recognizing the name. "Junior year, 2nd period. Very promising writer. Small world." Michael smiled. "I'll have to tell Jim. I met his daughter's teacher." The coincidence made me relax further. Someone connected to a student's family seemed inherently safer than a complete stranger. "The service station is just off the main exit," I said, peering through the rain-streaked windshield. "About 10 more minutes." Actually, Michael pointed to an upcoming turn. "There's a quicker route if you take Mill Road. Cuts behind the industrial park and saves about 5 minutes." I hesitated. "I don't think I know that way. I drive it all the time. Much faster. Especially this time of night with no traffic." Something about his certainty convinced me, and I turned where he indicated. The road narrowed immediately. Streetlights, becoming scarce. Trees crowded close to the pavement, their branches creating a tunnel effect in my headlights. "You're not from around here originally?" he asked, noticing my uncertainty with the route. "Born and raised in Millfield, actually. Just never had reason to come this way. It's a bit of a local secret," he explained. "Mostly used by people who work at the industrial park." As we talked, Michael asked thoughtful questions about teaching, showing genuine interest in my answers. He shared stories about his sister's classroom experiences that rang true, mentioning specific details about curriculum challenges and administrative politics that only someone familiar with education would know. "Left up here," he directed, pointing to an even narrower road. This one had no streetlights at all, and the houses had disappeared completely. My headlights illuminated only dense forest on both sides. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked, unease beginning to creep up my spine. "Positive. It looks worse than it is. Opens up just around this bend." I slowed the car, an inexplicable chill settling over me, despite the heater running. The rain hammered against the roof, isolating us in a cocoon of sound. "Mind if I check my phone?" Michael asked, reaching down toward the floorboard. "Sometimes. You can get a signal on the higher ground here." "Sure," I said, eyes fixed on the increasingly unfamiliar road. What I would later learn from police forensic analysis was that while appearing to reach for his phone, Michael was actually using a concealed tool to cut specific wires beneath my dashboard. The car's computer system would continue functioning normally for approximately 20 minutes before triggering cascading electrical failures, stranding us precisely where he intended. Would also learn that there was no Megan Sullivan at Westlake High. The name had been pulled from my own class roster, photographed weeks earlier, when I had left my gradebook open on my desk during lunch period. Michael had studied those names, preparing multiple conversation paths. Depending on which student, I confirmed knowing. "So your mother's in assisted living?" he asked, shifting topics smoothly. "That must be difficult, especially managing it alone after your divorce." I glanced over, surprised. "How did you know I was divorced?" He gestured casually to my hand. "No ring, but there's still a tan line. Recent, I'm guessing, 6 months ago," I confirmed, impressed by his observation skills, while missing the real significance. I had never mentioned my mother's living situation. The road curved again, taking us deeper into unfamiliar territory. The rain intensified, drumming against the car like impatient fingers. "It should open up any minute now," Michael assured me, checking his watch discreetly. I nodded, increasingly certain we were lost, but reluctant to admit it. The dashboard lights flickered briefly, so quickly I thought I'd imagined it. "Tell me about your students," he prompted. "Any future novelists in the making?" As I answered, describing my creative writing elective class, Michael nodded with perfect attentiveness, while his hand moved slightly beneath his raincoat. What I couldn't see was that he was sending a pre-programmed text message. The message contained only a string of numbers, coordinates for our current location, and a timing confirmation. I also didn't know that the service station he'd mentioned had closed permanently 3 years earlier, or that his disabled car on Route 16 was already being retrieved by an accomplice, leaving no evidence of our encounter, or that my Honda was now being tracked via a magnetized GPS device he had subtly attached while helping me navigate a particularly deep puddle 10 minutes earlier. Instead, I simply continued driving deeper into the forest, feeling strangely comforted by the presence of this seemingly kind stranger who listened so attentively to stories about my classroom, all while the trap closed around me, minute by careful minute. We had been driving on the unmarked forest road for nearly 20 minutes when I realized something was wrong. The shortcut should have reached the main road by now, but instead, the path had narrowed further, tree branches scraping against the sides of my Honda. "I think we've missed a turn," I said, slowing the car. "This can't be right." Michael frowned, looking genuinely concerned. "Strange. It's been a while since I've come this way, but I was certain this was the route." He pulled out his phone. "Still no signal. Let me check the map app anyway. Sometimes it works offline." The dashboard lights flickered again, longer this time. A warning light I'd never seen before, illuminated briefly, then disappeared. "Did you see that?" I asked. "Probably just the storm interfering with the electrical system," Michael said smoothly. "These country roads have outdated power infrastructure. Creates electromagnetic anomalies during heavy rain." His explanation sounded plausible, delivered with casual confidence. But something about it bothered me. Why would roadside power lines affect my car's internal systems? A strange metallic smell filled the car, subtle but distinct. I wrinkled my nose. "Do you smell that?" Michael sniffed performatively. "Just the heater, I think. Older cars sometimes get that burning dust smell when the heater runs too long." My Honda was only 3 years old, hardly what I'd consider older. But before I could point this out, the dashboard lights flickered a third time, and the GPS screen went completely dark. "That's not normal," I muttered, a tendril of fear beginning to curl through my stomach. "Let's pull over for a minute," Michael suggested. "I can take a look under the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but I know the basics." I pulled onto a small turnout, barely visible in the headlights. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but the surrounding forest seemed to absorb all sound, creating an unnatural silence. broken only by water dripping from leaves. Pop the hood, Michael asked. I reached for the release lever, then hesitated. Something felt wrong. The metallic smell was stronger now, making me slightly lightheaded. The isolated location, the convenient electrical problems, Michael's excessive knowledge about my personal life. Actually, I said, keeping my hand on the gear shift, I think we should turn around, go back to the main road, and find a real mechanic. A flash of something crossed Michael's face, there and gone so quickly, I almost missed it. Annoyance? Calculation? Of course, he agreed, his affable demeanor instantly restored. Whatever makes you comfortable. Though I'm not sure how far we'll get if your electrical system is failing. As if responding to his words, the dashboard lights dimmed noticeably. The headlights followed, weakening to a pale yellow glow that barely illuminated the road ahead. That's not good, I whispered, fear crystallizing into something sharp and real. Let me just take a quick look, Michael insisted. We should at least know what we're dealing with before trying to drive back in this condition. Against my better judgment, I pulled the hood release. Michael stepped out into the drizzle, disappearing behind the raised hood. I watched his shadowy movements, trying to make sense of my growing unease. The metallic smell was definitely stronger now. I cracked my window, hoping for fresh air. Instead, the forest's damp stillness pressed in, heavy with the scent of wet soil and something else, something chemical beneath the natural odors. My head felt strangely foggy. Thoughts coming slower than they should. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. The screen seemed to blur slightly as I looked at it. Definitely an electrical issue, Michael announced, closing the hood and returning to the passenger seat. Water beaded on his raincoat, dripping onto the upholstery. Looks like a loose connection to the alternator. I tightened it as best I could. But we should get moving before the battery drains completely. I nodded, putting the car in gear, fighting against a growing dizziness. The headlights strengthened momentarily, then dimmed again. We crawled forward, the Honda moving sluggishly. Is anyone expecting you home tonight? Michael asked casually. Maybe we could call them when we get back. In cell range, let them know you'll be late. My brother. I lied, unsure why I felt the need to do so. He's staying with me this week. Military leave. A strange expression flickered across Michael's face. Was it doubt? Concern? My vision blurred slightly, making it difficult to read his features. You never mentioned a brother, he said lightly. Didn't I? My tongue felt oddly thick. He's very protective, always checking up on me. What I didn't know then was that the metallic smell came from a chemical compound Michael had released from a concealed dispenser in his pocket. A compound designed to cause gradual disorientation while remaining undetectable in standard toxicology screenings. That he had been steadily increasing the dosage since we turned onto the isolated road, carefully monitoring my symptoms. I also didn't know that while examining my electrical issue, he had disabled my brake lines, ensuring they would fail gradually, rather than all at once, making it appear to be mechanical failure rather than sabotage, or that my lie about my brother had disrupted a carefully orchestrated timeline, forcing an adjustment to what Michael's journal would later call the acquisition sequence. The car shuddered, headlights dimming to near darkness before strengthening again. We rounded a curve, and the road ended abruptly in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. No continuation, no access to main roads, just wilderness and the increasingly certain knowledge that I'd made a terrible, potentially fatal mistake. Looks like we've got a problem, Michael said, his voice changing, subtly, as he reached into his jacket pocket. End of the road, Michael said, his voice dropping its friendly tone like a discarded mask. Quite literally, my car's engine died with a shudder, headlights dimming to nothing, leaving us in darkness, broken only by faint moonlight filtering through rain clouds. The metallic smell had become overwhelming, making my thoughts swim and limbs feel heavy. "I need to call for help," I mumbled, fumbling for my phone. "No service, remember." Michael's voice came from beside me, suddenly too close. No one to call, no one to hear. The subtle shift in his demeanor sent ice through my veins, temporarily cutting through the chemical fog clouding my mind. This wasn't the helpful stranger from Route 16. This was someone else entirely. "My brother's expecting me," I insisted, grasping at the lie I'd told earlier. "He'll come looking when I don't arrive." "Your brother is deployed overseas," Michael replied calmly. "Afghanistan, I believe. Not due back for 3 months." The precise knowledge of my actual brother's whereabouts struck me like physical blow. This wasn't random. Nothing about this was random. "How do you—" My tongue felt too large for my mouth, words slurring slightly. "I know everything about you, Olivia Ann Kendall." He continued conversationally. "Born September 17th, 1986. Allergic to penicillin. Sleep on the left side of the bed, even though you live alone now. Grade papers with purple ink because you think red is too aggressive. Each personal detail landed like a slap. The violation of knowing I had been watched, studied, catalogued. What do you want?" I managed to ask. Fighting against the chemical disorientation, Michael reached into his jacket pocket, extracting not a weapon, as I feared, but a small flashlight. He clicked it on, illuminating the car interior with harsh white light that hurt. My eyes. "I want what I always want, Olivia. What I've taken before. What I'll take again after you." The clinical detachment in his voice terrified me more than rage or lust would have. This was something calculated, practiced, perfected over time. I fumbled for the door handle, yanking it open and half falling out into the wet darkness. My legs buckled immediately, the drug in my system affecting my coordination. Still, animal instinct propelled me forward, away from the car, away from him. Behind me, Michael exited the passenger side with unhurried confidence. "You won't get far in your condition," he called after me. "The compound affects the vestibular system first. Balance, then motor coordination, then consciousness. In that order." I stumbled into the trees, rain-soaked branches slapping my face. The forest floor tilted and swayed beneath my feet like the deck of a ship in high seas. I fell repeatedly, mud soaking into my clothes, but kept moving through sheer desperate will. This part is always so unnecessary. Michael's voice came from behind me, closer than should have been possible given my head start. "The running, the panic. It changes nothing except making you filthy and exhausted when I catch you." The casual when, rather than if, sent fresh terror through me. I veered sharply left, hoping to circle back toward the road, any road. Instead, I found myself facing a steep embankment, invisible in the darkness until I was nearly upon it. I tried to stop, but momentum and drug-impaired coordination sent me tumbling down the muddy slope, pain flaring in my ankle as it twisted beneath me. I landed at the bottom, breath knocked from my lungs, staring up at a narrow strip of sky between tree canopies. Footsteps approached from above, methodical and unhurried. A beam of light played across my body. "Textbook flight response," Michael observed clinically. "Though you made it 47 meters farther than statistical average for your body weight and dosage level. Impressive." I tried to push myself up, but my limbs had grown impossibly heavy. The chemical was taking stronger hold with every passing minute. What I didn't know then was that the isolated clearing where my car died wasn't random wilderness. The police investigation would later reveal it was privately owned land, purchased through a shell corporation 3 years earlier, that the embankment I had fallen down had been specifically modified to create a natural trap, its sides too steep for easy climbing, even when unimpaired. I also didn't know that this location had been used before, that cadaver dogs would eventually find remains of 3 women buried at precise intervals around the clearing, that Michael had a system, a ritual, a process he had refined over years, that I was simply the latest in a carefully selected series. Time to go home, Olivia, Michael said from the top of the embankment, a coil of rope now visible in his hands. My home, where you belong. Michael descended the embankment with practiced ease. Rope looped over one shoulder, flashlight beam trained on my face. To blind and disorient me further, I could barely make out his silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. The more you struggle, the more energy you waste, he said, voice clinically detached. The compound is already in your bloodstream. Fighting extends your consciousness temporarily through adrenaline production, but accelerates overall metabolic absorption. Counterproductive. His scientific explanation chilled me more than threats would have. This wasn't passion or impulse. This was methodology, process, routine. People are looking for me, I managed to say, though my tongue felt swollen. Words slurring despite my efforts. No one is looking for you, Michael corrected, now standing directly over me. Your absence won't be noted until Monday morning when you fail to appear for first period. By then, we'll be long finished. The casual certainty in his voice, the predetermined timeline, sent fresh terror through me. I tried to scramble backward, but my limbs moved as if through molasses. Uncoordinated and weak. Your fear response is typical, he continued, kneeling beside me. Though your physiological resistance to the compound is statistically unusual, most subjects are completely incapacitated by this stage. I'm not a subject, I spat, anger momentarily burning through the chemical fog. I'm a person, Olivia Kendall, English teacher, someone who matters. Something flickered across Michael's face. Brief interest replacing clinical detachment. Fascinating. Self-assertion as resistance strategy. Rarely observed at this stage of processing. He began uncoiling the rope with methodical precision. Standard restraint protocol is necessary despite your impaired condition. Previous experience indicates unpredictable adrenaline surges can temporarily override chemical constraints. As he reached for my wrists, some primal survival instinct sent a surge of desperate strength through my drugged body. I struck out with my right hand, fingers curved into claws. Connecting with his face, my nails tore through flesh, drawing blood that appeared black in the dim light. Michael recoiled, hand going to his cheek, expression shifting from detached to focused anger. That was unprecedented, he said quietly, and extremely unwise. The momentary satisfaction of fighting back evaporated as he extracted something from his jacket pocket. A syringe, its contents gleaming faintly in the flashlight beam. Secondary. Sedation is normally unnecessary, he said, uncapping the needle. You're proving exceptional in multiple parameters tonight. I tried to roll away, but my injured ankle collapsed under me. Michael's hand shot out, fingers digging into my hair, yanking my head back to expose my neck. The needle approached my skin with terrifying inevitability. In that moment of absolute desperation, my hand closed around something hard and cold in the mud. A rock, fist-sized and jagged. With every ounce of remaining strength, I swung it upward, connecting with the side of Michael's head with a sickening crack. He released me immediately, falling sideways, the syringe dropping from his fingers. Blood, darker than the mud began flowing from his temple, his eyes wide with shock. "That's not protocol," he mumbled, voice suddenly slurred, an echo of my own drug-affected speech. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. Using the rock as leverage, I dragged myself up the embankment, progress agonizingly slow against the slippery mud and my own fading coordination. Every inch was a battle against gravity, terrain, and the chemicals flooding my system. Behind me, I heard Michael moving, recovering faster than should have been humanly possible given the blow I'd delivered. Deviation from established parameters requires procedural adjustment. He called after me, voice steadying, but outcome remains unchanged. I reached the top of the embankment, arms burning with effort, clothes soaked with rain and mud. My car sat dark and dead in the clearing ahead. Its familiar shape, both salvation and trap. Even if I reached it, the engine wouldn't start, the doors wouldn't lock. It offered no real escape. What I didn't know then was that the blow I'd delivered had fractured Michael's temporal bone, an injury that would have incapacitated or killed a normal person. The police investigation would later reveal high levels of synthetic opioids and performance enhancers in his system, explaining his unnatural tolerance for pain and injury. I also didn't know that the forest contained motion-activated cameras he had installed weeks earlier, recording our hunt from multiple angles for later review, and what his journal called procedure refinement, that in a hidden bunker 50 yards beyond the clearing sat a computer system automatically uploading this footage to encrypted servers, ensuring his work would survive regardless of his own fate, that my desperate fight was being observed, evaluated and archived as it happened. I reached the edge of the clearing, just as Michael crested the embankment behind me, blood streaming down his face, eyes reflecting the moonlight with inhuman intensity. Exceptional performance metrics. He called after me, but the conclusion remained statistically inevitable. I stumbled across the clearing toward my car, each step a negotiation with my failing body. The chemicals' effects were reaching their peak, vision blurring, extremities numbing. Only raw survival instinct kept me moving forward. Behind me, Michael's footsteps approached with unhurried confidence. "Your vehicle provides no viable escape option," he called out. "Engine electrical system is completely disabled. Consider your strategic alternatives." His analytical tone during a life-or-death pursuit was profoundly disturbing, as if this were an academic exercise rather than murder in progress. I reached my Honda, yanking at the driver's door, falling inside more than sitting. The familiar interior offered psychological comfort, but no practical safety. Through the windshield, I watched Michael approach, his movements precise, despite the blood coating half his face. In his hand gleamed the syringe he had recovered. "The secondary compound will terminate resistance patterns," he stated, reaching the car. "Voluntary compliance remains preferable, but is not required for successful acquisition." As he leaned in through the open driver's door, I remembered the emergency kit my father had insisted I keep under the passenger seat. I lunged across the center console, hand fumbling beneath the seat, fingers closing around cold metal. Michael misinterpreted my movement as an attempt to escape through the passenger door. He circled the hood quickly, giving me precious seconds to extract the emergency hammer my father had included in the kit for breaking windows, in case you drive into a lake. I'd always thought the scenario absurdly specific. Now it seemed prophetic. When Michael opened the passenger door, I was waiting, hammer gripped in both hands. I swung with desperate strength, connecting with his forearm. The syringe flew from his grasp, disappearing into the darkness outside. His expression shifted from clinical detachment to focused rage. Procedural complications require immediate resolution, he snarled, reaching for me with both hands. I swung the hammer again, missing his head but striking his shoulder. He barely flinched, hands closing around my throat with crushing pressure. My vision darkened at the edges, lungs burning for oxygen, with fading consciousness. I brought the hammer down one final time, connecting with his already injured temple. The impact produced a sound I will never forget, something between a crack and a squelch. His grip loosened immediately. Michael staggered backward, a look of genuine surprise replacing the rage. "Statistical anomaly," he whispered, blood now pouring from both his temple and ear. "Subject exceeding all projected parameters." He collapsed outside the passenger door, body jerking uncontrollably. I didn't wait to see if he would recover again. I slammed and locked the door, then crawled across to secure the driver's side as well. The keys were still in the ignition. I turned them desperately, knowing the engine was dead, but hoping for a miracle. Nothing, not even a click. My phone remained without signal. The chemical in my system continued its inexorable effect, consciousness fading despite adrenaline. Outside, Michael had stopped moving, but I couldn't trust that, wouldn't trust that. I remembered the hammer in my hand, using its pointed end to smash my driver's side window. The safety glass fractured into tiny chunks, rather than dangerous shards, just as designed. Cool night, air rushed in, temporarily clearing my head. I extracted myself through the window, glass chunks catching on my clothing, small cuts opening on my arms. The pain was distant, disconnected from my drugged body. I half fell to the ground outside, forcing myself upright through sheer will. Michael remained motionless by the passenger door. I gave his body a wide berth, uncertain if this was genuine incapacitation or tactical deception. The forest surrounded the clearing on all sides, dense and disorienting, offering concealment, but no clear escape route. I chose a direction opposite from the embankment and stumbled forward, using trees for support. Each step was a negotiation, each breath a conscious choice, as the compound tried to shut down my voluntary nervous system. What I didn't know then was that my second blow had driven bone fragments into Michael's brain, causing catastrophic intracranial bleeding. That despite his enhanced pain tolerance and drug cocktail, this injury was unsurvivable without immediate surgical intervention. I also didn't know that the forest contained only one viable exit route, deliberately maintained and marked with infrared indicators, visible only with specialized equipment. That all other paths led deeper into the wilderness, away from roads and potential rescue. That in his confidence, Michael had deviated from his own protocols by not informing his associate of our exact location, believing this acquisition routine enough to handle alone. The darkness between the trees thickened as clouds obscured the moon completely. Rain began falling again, cold drops penetrating my torn clothing. My strength was failing rapidly, movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated. I fell repeatedly, each time taking longer to rise. Behind me, still visible through the trees, my car's broken window gaped like a wound in the night. Michael's body hadn't moved, but deep instinct told me I couldn't stop, couldn't rest, couldn't surrender to the chemical pulling me toward unconsciousness. So I continued forward, one excruciating step after another, guided only by the certainty that stopping meant death. I don't remember much about those hours in the forest. The chemical in my system created gaps in my memory, black holes where time disappeared. I remember rain, cold that penetrated to bone, the texture of rough bark under my hands as I used trees to pull myself forward when my legs would no longer carry my weight. Consciousness came in waves, receding further each time. During one lucid moment, I found myself crawling along what seemed to be a game trail. Hands bloody from sharp rocks hidden in the mud. Another flash of awareness revealed stars overhead, clouds temporarily parted, their cold light offering no warmth or direction. How long I wandered, I can't say with certainty. The police report would later estimate 4 to 6 hours, based on evidence and timeline reconstruction. To me, it felt both endless and instantaneous. Time rendered meaningless by chemicals and terror. My clearest memory is of the highway. I had been moving downhill, following the path of least resistance as my strength failed completely. Suddenly, through a break in the trees, I saw lights. Moving lights. Cars on a distant road. That sight triggered a final surge of desperate energy. I crawled, dragged, and stumbled my way toward those lights. Progress measured in inches rather than steps. The chemical had almost completed its work. Consciousness slipping away, despite my desperate fight to remain awake. When my body finally broke through the tree line, I found myself at the top of a steep drainage ditch, above a highway. Below, occasional cars passed, their headlights appearing and disappearing, like hope briefly illuminated, then extinguished. I had no strength to call out, no ability to climb down the steep, concrete sides of the drainage channel. All I could do was force my body forward, letting gravity do what muscle could not. I rolled and slid down the incline, pain registering distantly through the chemical haze, finally coming to rest on the narrow shoulder of the road. A semi-truck passed, its wind wake buffeting my broken body. Then headlights approached from the opposite direction, slowing as they illuminated my crumpled form on the roadside. I learned later it was a state trooper returning from an accident call, taking a less traveled route back to the station. He saw what he thought was a bundle of rags blown onto the highway, then recognized the shape as human. I remember red and blue lights, a crackling radio, a voice saying words I couldn't comprehend. Then darkness took me completely. I woke 3 days later in county hospital, wrists restrained to prevent me from pulling out IV lines in drug-induced delirium. My brother James sat beside the bed in his military uniform, face haggard from emergency, international travel, and sleepless worry. "You're safe," he said when he saw consciousness return to my eyes. "You're safe now, Liv." But I wasn't. Not really. The investigation began immediately. My broken statement recorded by detectives, who treated me with careful gentleness that somehow made everything worse. Descriptions of Michael, the car, the clearing, everything I could remember through the chemical haze and trauma they found. My Honda first, following the GPS in my phone, which had remained in the vehicle. Michael's body lay nearby, exactly where I'd left him. The hammer still bore traces of his blood and tissue. Despite the rain, self-defense was never questioned. The evidence was overwhelming. His car recovered from Route 16, disabled exactly as I had described. The rope, syringe, and chemical dispenser found at the scene. GPS coordinates of the clearing programmed into a device in his pocket. What no one expected was the rest of what they found. A hidden bunker containing recording equipment, specialized chemicals, and detailed documentation of previous acquisitions. 3 bodies recovered from the surrounding forest. Women reported missing over the previous 18 months. Computer files containing surveillance photos of dozens more potential victims, including a folder labeled Pipeline with my own information, meticulously catalogued. Most disturbing was his journal, recovered from a waterproof case in the bunker. Hundreds of pages detailing his methodology, experiments, and refinements to his techniques. My own name appeared repeatedly in the final entries, with phrases like optimal candidate and final acquisition before relocation. I had not been selected randomly. I had been chosen, studied, and prepared for months, every detail of my life catalogued and analyzed for exploitation potential, my routine mapped with military precision, my patterns of behavior tested through staged encounters at grocery stores, gas stations, and parking lots. I had no memory of, but security cameras confirmed. The journal's final entry, dated the day he took me, read simply, Acquisition Day, Procedure. Commences 20.45 hours. Estimated completion, 02.30 hours. Subject, shows ideal compliance indicators during preconditioning phase. Success probability, 94.3%. What I didn't know during those months of recovery and investigation was that Michael's real name wasn't Michael Reeves, but Martin Reynolds, wanted, in connection with disappearances in 3 other states under different identities, that the financial consulting business he claimed to operate was a real firm whose owner had been found dead in his home 5 months earlier, his identity appropriated and modified for Reynolds' use, that the compound he used on me was an experimental military-grade incapacitating agent stolen from a research facility where he had once worked as a security contractor. Most importantly, I didn't know that the journal contained references to an associate, someone who helped prepare acquisition sites and disposed of vehicles afterward, someone never identified or captured, someone who had access to all of Reynolds' methods, materials, and potential victim files, someone who knew I had survived when no one else had. Someone still out there. Recovery is a word that suggests completion, a return to wholeness. What happened to me wasn't something I recovered from, but something I learned to carry. The physical healing came first. Ankle fracture, requiring surgical repair. Lacerations, from glass and underbrush. Chemical toxicity affecting liver and kidney function. The doctors spoke of remarkable resilience and fortunate metabolism that had allowed me to fight off the compound's effects longer than should have been possible. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, first in intensive care, then in a private room with a police officer stationed outside, not for my protection, they insisted, but because I was a material witness in an ongoing investigation. The distinction felt meaningless. Either way, I was being watched. Detective Ramirez led the investigation, a woman with tired eyes and methodical thoroughness that reminded me, uncomfortably, of Reynolds himself. She visited daily, each time with new questions sparked by discoveries. At the site, as she called the clearing, we found recording equipment, she told me one afternoon. Voice carefully neutral, motion-activated cameras throughout the forest, focused on specific areas. He was recording it. The violation expanded with each revelation, layers of horror unfolding endlessly. Yes, and previous incidents as well. She chose her words with clinical precision. The footage has been essential for identifying the other victims. 3 confirmed, more suspected. Women who hadn't managed what I had. Women who didn't have a state trooper happen upon them at exactly the right moment. Women who hadn't been statistically anomalous in their resistance. My survival felt random, unearned. Survivor's guilt, the hospital psychologist called it. A normal response to abnormal circumstances. Nothing about this was normal. My mother visited daily. Having been moved to a care facility closer to the hospital, her frailty seemed more pronounced. Against the backdrop of what had happened, her protective instincts frustrated by her physical limitations, I knew something was wrong. She repeated during each visit. I felt it that Sunday. Should have said more. James took leave from his deployment, sleeping in a chair beside my hospital bed for 2 weeks before military obligations forced his return. I'm having you moved in with me when I get back, he insisted. My apartment on base has security. Checkpoints, Armed guards. The idea of being surrounded by more men, even in uniform, made my skin crawl. But I nodded anyway, understanding his need to protect, to fix, to solve. Rachel visited with forced cheerfulness that cracked when she thought I wasn't looking. She brought books I couldn't focus on and food I couldn't taste. Everyone at school sends their love, she said, as if I were recovering from the flu rather than attempted murder. School. The thought of returning to my classroom, of standing before students and discussing literature as if I were the same person who had left that rainy night, seemed impossible. Yet financial reality loomed beneath the trauma. Bills continued, despite victimhood, when Detective Ramirez mentioned victim compensation funds. I felt simultaneous relief and humiliation. Even my financial survival now depended on my status as a victim, an identity I had never wanted and could never escape. The hospital psychologist spoke of PTSD, anxiety disorders, and pharmaceutical management options. I nodded through these sessions, playing the role of cooperative patient, while knowing no medication could erase what had been burned into my mind. What I didn't share with her or anyone were the dreams, not nightmares about what had happened, but worse somehow, dreams about Reynolds surviving, about him finding me again, about the associate mentioned in his journal appearing in my hospital room, in my classroom, in my mother's care facility. Didn't tell them how I checked every room before entering, testing door locks multiple times each night, how I photographed my car's interior before leaving it anywhere, comparing the images upon return to detect the slightest change, how I kept the emergency hammer from my Honda under my hospital pillow, unable to sleep without its weight beside me. What I didn't know then was that these weren't paranoid delusions, but practical survival adaptations, that the journal recovered from Reynolds's bunker contained more than theoretical mentions of an associate, that somewhere in the city, someone was watching news reports of my survival with growing interest, making notes in a journal that mirrored Reynolds with frightening precision, that my recovery was being observed, evaluated, and documented by eyes I couldn't see. Detective Ramirez brought the journal 2 months after the attack. Once I'd been released from the hospital and was staying in James's empty apartment on the military base. We've completed analysis of Reynolds' documentation, she said, placing a thick binder on the coffee table between us. This contains relevant excerpts. I need you to review it for anything familiar, any details that might help us locate his associate. Associate? I'd heard the term before, but had assumed it was theoretical, not an actual person. Ramirez's expression tightened. The evidence suggests Reynolds worked with a partner, someone who helped prepare sites, dispose of vehicles, and handle aftermath logistics. The clinical language barely disguised the horror of what aftermath logistics must entail: someone who disposed of bodies, someone still free. We believe this individual had access to Reynolds's victim selection criteria and preliminary surveillance data, she continued, including information about potential targets, not yet acquired. The implications landed like physical blows. Someone out there had files on women who didn't know they were being hunted. Someone with all of Reynolds' methodology, but none of his mistakes. The binder contained photocopied pages from Reynolds' journal, his precise handwriting cataloging horror with scientific detachment. I forced myself to read entries about his surveillance of me, fighting nausea as I encountered detailed observations of my daily routines, selected subject displays, optimal isolation parameters despite social profession, limited personal connections, following pair bond dissolution, predictable movement patterns. Psychological testing indicates above average empathy response to perceived distress scenarios. I remembered those testing scenarios now. The elderly man who had dropped groceries in the parking lot, the woman with a crying baby who had asked for help loading her car, the teenage boy who had approached me about a lost dog. All manufactured situations designed to evaluate my helpfulness to strangers. All orchestrated by Reynolds, observing from a distance, measuring my responses, determining my suitability as a victim. The final pages contained references to A, an operational coordination for what Reynolds called the acquisition phase. Phrases like a will handle vehicle removal and site preparation completed by A, according to specifications, confirmed Ramirez's assessment. Reynolds hadn't worked alone. Have you found any identification for this person? I asked, closing the binder, unable to read more. Nothing concrete. Reynolds was methodical about operational security. We have evidence of electronic communications through encrypted channels, but no recoverable content. No DNA, besides Reynolds and the victims, at any of the sites. No witnesses who remember seeing him with associates. The perfect partner in crime. Invisible, untraceable, still active. What about the other potential victims? The ones in his files? I asked. We've contacted everyone we could identify, Ramirez said. Provided security recommendations and protective surveillance where warranted. But the files weren't comprehensive. Some contained only photographs or partial information, not enough for identification. Unknown women under unknown threat. The weight of that knowledge pressed against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. There's something else, Ramirez said, hesitation evident in her usually confident demeanor. Something we haven't released. To the public, she extracted a sealed evidence bag from her briefcase. Inside was a single page, the paper newer than the journal entries. This was delivered to the station 3 weeks after Reynolds' death. No fingerprints, no traceable paper, no identifiable handwriting characteristics. The page contained 5 typewritten lines. Subject exceeded statistical parameters. Procedural adjustments required. Methodology refinement ongoing. Acquisition operations temporarily suspended. Future subject selection criteria modified to exclude. Anomalous resistance indicators. Cold horror washed through me as I recognized Reynolds' clinical language pattern, but not his handwriting. This wasn't from his journal. This was new, recent, from someone who thought exactly like him. The associate, I whispered. Ramirez nodded grimly. We believe so. They're still active, still planning, just adjusting their methodology based on what happened with you. Why show me this? My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Because you're the only one who's encountered their operation and survived, she replied. And because we have reason to believe they're maintaining surveillance on you. The apartment suddenly felt exposed. Windows like eyes watching from every direction. The security of the military base seemed illusory against someone with Reynolds' level of planning and determination. We need your help to catch them, Ramirez continued. But I won't pretend it doesn't put you at risk. What I didn't know then was that Ramirez was withholding additional notes that had been delivered. Notes specifically mentioning me by name and location. That the surveillance wasn't theoretical, but confirmed through evidence, too disturbing to. I share with the traumatized victim that the investigation had uncovered a pattern spanning 15 years and 7 states, suggesting an operation far larger than Reynolds alone could have maintained, that my survival hadn't ended the nightmare. It had only revealed its true scope. Becoming bait was my idea. Detective Ramirez objected initially, citing victim trauma and departmental liability, but I persisted, driven by something beyond rational thought. They're watching me anyway, I argued during our 4th strategy meeting. We might as well use that to draw them out. It's too dangerous. Ramirez countered. We don't know their capabilities or resources. Reynolds had military training, specialized equipment, and pharmaceutical access. We have to assume his associate has the same. I survived Reynolds, I said, the words bitter in my mouth. I can survive long enough for you to catch this one. What I didn't say was that survival alone wasn't enough. That waking each day, wondering if today was when they would come for me, had become its own form of torture. That ending this, one way or another, felt like the only path forward. Eventually, Ramirez relented, though the operation would be classified as passive surveillance rather than active bait to satisfy departmental protocols. I would return to my normal life, teaching and visiting my mother, while a task force monitored from a distance, waiting for Reynolds' associate to make contact. We'll have undercover officers in your school, Ramirez explained. Surveillance, teams monitoring your home and regular locations, tracking devices on your vehicle and person, panic button functionality added to your phone. The layers of surveillance that were supposed to make me feel safe, instead, created a suffocating awareness of being constantly watched by protectors, by predators. The distinctions sometimes blurring in my hyper-vigilant state. I returned to teaching 5 months after the attack, standing before my classroom. Required performance skills I hadn't known I possessed, maintaining a facade of normalcy while scanning each face for threat indicators, each shadow for movement. The new English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was actually Officer Rodriguez from the task force. The janitor was a retired detective. The parent volunteer in the front office was an intelligence analyst. My students noticed the change in me, despite my efforts. The flinching at sudden sounds, the way I positioned myself with walls at my back, the new habit of checking sight lines before entering any space. Ms. Kendall jumps like a cat around loud noises. I overheard one student telling another, My mom says it's because of what happened to her. The story had made regional news, despite efforts to protect my privacy. Local teacher survives abduction attempt, ran alongside serial killer, stopped by quick-thinking victim. The articles omitted the worst details, but included enough to make me an object of horrified fascination. Parents requested meetings to express support while satisfying their curiosity. Colleagues offered help they couldn't actually provide. The school counselor suggested resources I was already using through the Victim Services Program. Through it all, I maintained the routine necessary for the operation, regular grocery shopping on Tuesdays, bank visits on alternate Fridays, evening walks around the neighborhood when weather permitted, normal patterns to attract abnormal attention. 3 weeks into the surveillance operation, Ramirez called an emergency meeting. We've identified unusual activity, she said, without preamble. Digital intrusions in your school record system. Accessing your teaching schedule. Potential surveillance vehicle observed near your mother's care facility. 3 separate occasions. Electronic scanning signals detected around your apartment, suggesting attempt to identify security systems. My heart rate accelerated. Fear and vindication colliding. It's them. We believe so, Ramirez confirmed. The methodology matches Reynolds' electronic signatures. Careful, indirect, but persistent. What now? We continue as planned, but with enhanced security parameters. No movements without advanced team preparation. No unscheduled stops or route deviations. Direct communication channel, open at all times. The next phase felt like living inside a glass box. Visible from all sides, but unable to move freely. Task. Force members shadowed my every movement, their presence both reassuring and suffocating. Unmarked vehicles positioned at strategic points around locations I frequented. Surveillance equipment monitored my apartment from multiple angles. A week later, Detective Ramirez arrived at my door, unannounced, her expression grave. "We've intercepted a communication," she said, once inside. An encrypted message sent through channels associated with Reynolds' operation. It contained your schedule for the next week, and the phrase, "acquisition parameters confirmed." The clinical language, so similar to Reynolds' journal entries, sent ice through my veins. "They're making their move," Ramirez nodded grimly. "We believe so. The operational analysis suggests they'll attempt contact within the next 72 hours. Where? Based on pattern analysis, most likely during your Tuesday grocery shopping. It provides optimal isolation during your walk from the store to the parking structure. What I didn't know then was that the task force had intercepted not one message, but a series of communications between multiple individuals. That Reynolds' associate was actually a network of at least 3 operators working in coordination. That the surveillance operation had revealed not a lone predator, but a systematic operation with potential connections to human trafficking networks. That my role as bait had exposed something far more extensive and organized than anyone had anticipated, and that despite all the surveillance and preparation, I was walking into danger beyond what even Ramirez understood. Tuesday arrived with oppressive normalcy. I selected produce while scanning for surveillance, checked expiration dates while monitoring exit routes, paid with cash while maintaining awareness of other shoppers who lingered too long or showed too much interest. The grocery store's fluorescent lighting cast everyone in sickly pallor, making threat assessment more difficult. I completed my shopping according to the established pattern, neither hurrying nor dawdling, the weight of eyes upon me, both protective and predatory, pressing against my skin like physical touch. Proceeding to parking structure, I murmured into the concealed microphone beneath my scarf. Following planned route, Detective Ramirez's voice came through the nearly invisible earpiece. "Confirmed. Teams in position. Maintain normal pace and behavior." I pushed my cart toward the elevated walkway connecting the store to the parking garage, the most vulnerable point in my routine. Concrete walls on both sides, limited visibility, restricted escape routes. Perfect for what Reynolds had called the acquisition phase. Halfway across the walkway, a man approached from the opposite direction. Mid-30s, business casual attire, unremarkable features. He glanced up from his phone as we prepared to pass each other, offering a brief smile. "Excuse me," he said, voice pleasant. "Do you know if the store carries gluten-free options? My wife has celiac disease." The question seemed innocent, but something in his eyes triggered recognition, not of the man himself, but of the calculated approach, the manufactured reason for interaction, the precise positioning that blocked my forward progress. "Potential contact," I whispered, the microphone catching my words. "Walkway midpoint. Identified." Ramirez confirmed in my ear. "Maintain engagement. Teams converging." I forced a smile, playing my role while scanning for additional threats. "They have a dedicated section in aisle 7. Thank you." The man replied, making no move to continue past me. "I'm actually new to the area, still learning my way around." The echo of Reynolds' approach technique sent adrenaline coursing through my system. The same disarming friendliness, the same created vulnerability requiring my assistance. "Welcome to Millfield," I managed to say, knuckles white on my shopping cart handle. "I understand you're a teacher," he continued, dropping all pretense of the gluten-free inquiry. "English literature at Westlake High." My blood turned to ice. Not a random approach, targeted, specific. He knew exactly who I was. "Subject confirmed," I whispered, the tremor in my voice betraying my fear despite months of preparation. Hold position, Ramirez instructed. 30 seconds to team intercept. The man took a step closer, his pleasant expression unchanging. We've been watching you, Olivia. Your resilience metrics are quite remarkable. Statistical anomalies always warrant further study. The clinical language, so similar to Reynolds, confirmed what we had suspected. This wasn't a copycat or coincidence. This was the associate, using the same methodology, the same evaluation parameters. Martin underestimated you, he continued conversationally. A methodological error we've since corrected in our protocols. Martin, Reynolds' real first name, a detail never released to the public. Teams in position. Ramirez's voice came through the earpiece. Prepare for takedown on my mark. The man's eyes flickered toward the ceiling of the walkway, then back to me. The surveillance team is quite thorough, he observed mildly, though their communications encryption requires significant upgrade. He knew. He had known all along. Unfortunately, this necessitates operational postponement. He sighed, seeming genuinely disappointed. Your file will remain active for future consideration once procedural adjustments are implemented. Mark, Ramirez commanded through the earpiece. Tactical teams converged from both ends of the walkway. Officers in tactical gear, moving with practiced efficiency. The man made no attempt to flee or resist. His hands raised in calm surrender, expression unchanged. Subject in custody, Ramirez confirmed minutes later, as officers secured him. Perimeter established. Secondary threats neutralized at north and east exits. 3 arrests total. The man who approached me, a woman who had been monitoring from a bookstore across the street, a third individual, in a maintenance uniform, who had been tampering with the parking structure, security cameras. What I didn't know then was that they were only the visible elements of a larger network. That subsequent investigation would reveal connections to 7 additional operatives across 3 states. That digital evidence recovered from encrypted servers would document over 30 successful acquisitions over 12 years. Most victims never reported missing due to careful selection criteria targeting those society had already forgotten. I also didn't know that despite the arrests, the network's full extent remained undetermined, that some of those involved would never be identified or apprehended, that the files recovered would contain hundreds of potential targets, women who had been observed, evaluated, and catalogued for future acquisition consideration. The aftermath stretched beyond resolution or closure. Trials proceeded with clinical testimony about subject selection and acquisition methodology that reduced human beings to data points in a grotesque experiment. Victims were identified where possible, families notified of fates worse than the uncertainty they had lived with for years. My own life continued in a strange liminal space between survivor and perpetual target. The rational knowledge that the immediate threat had been neutralized did little to quiet the hypervigilance that had become my constant companion. I still check my backseat before entering my car, still vary my routes home from school, still maintain the emergency hammer within reach at all times, still wake at the slightest sound in the night, heart racing, body prepared for fight or flight. The stain on my backseat never completely disappeared, despite professional cleaning. I keep the car anyway. The persistent mark a reminder of both survival and vulnerability, of how quickly normal life can transform into nightmare with one decision, one moment of misplaced trust. What I know now, with absolute certainty, is that some predators look exactly like everyone else, that they walk among us, selecting, evaluating, waiting for the perfect moment, that they study our habits, Our routines, our tendency to override instinct with politeness. And I know that somewhere, someone might still have my file, waiting for operational protocols to be adjusted, for security, parameters to be updated, for the optimal moment to implement acquisition procedures. The red stain remains, and so does the fear. The trial began 8 months after the arrests. Commonwealth versus Robert Shelton, the man from the walkway, became the central case among multiple prosecutions stemming from the investigation. I was the primary witness, my testimony crucial for connecting Shelton to Reynolds and establishing the network's methodology. Preparing to testify meant reliving every moment of that night on Route 16. Detective Ramirez and the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena Vasquez, guided me through the process with practiced efficiency that couldn't soften the psychological impact of revisiting trauma under scrutiny. They'll try to undermine your credibility, Vasquez warned during our final preparation session. Suggest your memory was compromised by the drugs. Imply you're conflating Reynolds with Shelton due to trauma. Question why you stopped for a stranger in the first place. Victim blaming disguised as defense strategy. I understood the tactics intellectually while still feeling the emotional impact of having my judgment questioned, my experience dissected. The courtroom itself became another form of captivity. Wood-paneled walls, limited exit routes, controlled movement, the defendant sitting 20 feet away, watching me with the same clinical interest Reynolds had shown, as if my testimony was simply another data point for analysis. Ms. Kendall, the defense attorney began during cross-examination. You've stated that the defendant used terminology similar to Martin Reynolds. Could you have been primed to hear such similarities given your traumatic experience? The similarities weren't subjective, I replied, focusing on Vasquez, rather than the attorney or Shelton. He referred to resilience metrics and statistical anomalies, specific phrases from Reynolds' journals that were never made public, and you're certain your memory of this encounter is accurate. Despite documented PTSD and the psychological impact of your previous experience, the questioning continued for hours. Attempts to create reasonable doubt by suggesting I was an unreliable narrator of my own experience. Throughout, Shelton watched with detached interest, occasionally writing notes to his attorney, his expression revealing nothing beyond mild curiosity. What disturbed me most was his absolute normalcy. No visible markers of the predator beneath the surface. No physical tells that might warn potential victims. Just an unremarkable man in business casual attire who could pass unnoticed in any crowd. Digital evidence provided what my testimony alone could not. Encrypted communications between Shelton and Reynolds. Surveillance photographs of me taken after Reynolds' death. Financial transactions linking Shelton to the purchase of chemical compounds, matching those found in Reynolds' bunker. Most damning were the files recovered from Shelton's encrypted servers. Hundreds of women catalogued with the same methodical precision Reynolds had used. Evaluation metrics, vulnerability assessments, acquisition suitability ratings, lives reduced to data points in a grotesque selection process. My name appeared in a special category labeled resilience anomalies, alongside notes about procedural adjustments and countermeasure development. They had been studying my survival, refining their methods to prevent future victims from escaping as I had. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I testified for 3 days. The jury deliberated for 9 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: attempted kidnapping, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and accessory to the murders committed by Reynolds. At sentencing, Shelton spoke for the first time, addressing the court with the same clinical detachment evident in the journals and files. The operational methodology remains sound despite implementational anomalies, he stated, ignoring his attorney's attempts to silence him. Subject selection criteria and acquisition protocols represent significant advancements in behavioral compliance induction. Future applications remain viable under modified parameters. The judge cited these statements when imposing maximum consecutive sentences, ensuring Shelton would never be released. Similar outcomes followed for his two associates arrested at the scene. Justice, by legal definition, had been served, yet closure remained elusive. Shelton's reference to future applications under modified parameters suggested the network extended beyond those captured. The files recovered contained communications with individuals identified only by alphanumeric designations, their identities and locations unknown. What I didn't know then was that investigations in other states had identified 3 additional operatives using similar methodology, suggesting a larger organization than initially believed. That digital forensics would eventually trace connections to an online forum where acquisition techniques were shared among like-minded predators. That some of those connected to this forum would never be identified or apprehended. That despite the convictions, the threat hadn't been eliminated, only temporarily disrupted. The trial ended. The media coverage faded. Life continued in its new, hyper-vigilant normal, and somewhere, someone might still have my file. I developed systems after the trial, routines disguised as ordinary habits, but designed for survival, never taking the same route home, twice in succession, varying grocery stores and shopping days, checking beneath my car with a telescoping mirror before entering, installing multiple security systems at my apartment, some visible, others hidden. My brother called them paranoid behaviors. My therapist labeled them hypervigilant symptoms. Detective Ramirez, who understood better than most, simply called them prudent precautions. The network was more extensive than we initially assessed, she told me during one of our monthly check-ins, a practice that continued long after the official case had closed. Investigations in 3 other states have identified similar operational patterns. You think there are more of them out there? I said. Not a question, but a confirmation of what I already suspected. We know there are, she replied, abandoning comforting lies for necessary truth. The question is whether any remain fixated on you specifically. The uncertainty created its own form of psychological torture. Not knowing if I remained a target of special interest or had been relegated to a cautionary case study in their methodology. Whether the eyes I sometimes felt watching me belonged to actual observers, or simply my traumatized mind, recreating the sensation of being hunted, I channeled the hypervigilance into productive avenues, where possible, became a consultant for law enforcement training programs about predatory behavior and victim selection patterns, helped develop educational materials warning about sophisticated predator methodologies, established a support network connecting survivors of similar crimes. These activities provided purpose, while also serving as protective coloration. Public visibility created a form of security through transparency, making me a less viable target. Due to increased awareness of my case, my classroom became both sanctuary and stage, a place where I could momentarily focus on literature rather than survival, while still maintaining constant awareness of my surroundings. My students adapted to my security measures, accepting them as personal quirks rather than trauma responses. Ms. Kendall always keeps her classroom door locked, I overheard one student telling another, and she needs to see who's knocking before she'll open it. Small adaptations accumulated into a comprehensive security system. Strategic furniture placement, ensuring no one could approach without being seen. Classroom supplies that could serve as improvised weapons if necessary. Multiple exit routes mentally mapped and physically practiced. My personal life contracted to minimize vulnerability points. Dating became an exercise in risk assessment rather than emotional connection. Social engagements evaluated for security parameters before enjoyment potential. Friendships tested by my inability to fully explain the constant tension that accompanied my every movement in public spaces. Rachel remained my closest friend, despite the strain, adapting to my new reality with remarkable patience. "Just tell me what you need," she said, when I apologized for checking restaurant seating for clear sight lines. Before agreeing to dinner, "I'd rather adjust than lose you." My mother's health declined steadily, adding another layer of complexity to my security calculations. The care facility required regular visits, following predictable patterns, creating vulnerability through routine. I varied my visiting times where possible, approached through different entrances, constantly scanned for surveillance indicators. "You're still afraid," my mother observed, during a moment of clarity in her increasing dementia. "I can see it in how you watch the doors." "Just careful, Mom," I replied. The automatic response, worn smooth through repetition. "There's careful and there's haunted," she said, surprising me with her lucidity. "You need to decide which one you're going to be." The distinction resonated more deeply than thousands of dollars in therapy had managed to achieve. Careful was adaptive, strategic, necessary. Haunted was allowing them to possess my future, as they had nearly taken my past. I began working with a self-defense instructor who specialized in training trauma survivors. Not just physical techniques, but psychological preparation for confrontation scenarios. Not to eliminate fear, but to function effectively despite it. To transform hypervigilance from paralyzing to empowering. What I didn't know then was that my public visibility and security measures had indeed altered my classification in the network's methodology. That intercepted communications described me as a compromised acquisition target, requiring specialized approach parameters beyond standard operational capacity. That my visibility had become my most effective protection, the network preferring targets without such public connection to previous cases. I also didn't know that despite this reclassification, my file remained active in their systems. That periodic surveillance still assessed my patterns and security measures. That my case had become a learning tool for methodology refinement, rather than an active acquisition target, but could revert to the latter if circumstances changed. The uncertainty remained my constant companion, even as I rebuilt a life around its persistent presence. Careful, not haunted, became my mantra. Vigilant, not paralyzed, my daily practice. 3 years after the trial, I received an email from a woman named Jennifer Larson. Subject line: "I was in his files too." My finger hovered over the delete button, suspicion being my default response to unsolicited contact. But something in the wording caught my attention. Not "I was almost taken," or "I had a similar experience," but specifically in his files. I forwarded it to Detective Ramirez. Before opening it, a security protocol we had established for questionable communications. Her response came within an hour. Verified legitimate. Larson was identified in Shelton's files during evidence processing. Security assessment indicates no current threat connection. The email contained a simple request for contact. No detailed information. After additional verification through Ramirez, I agreed to meet Jennifer at a public restaurant with police. Presence discreetly arranged nearby. She arrived precisely on time. A woman perhaps 5 years younger than me, with the same hyper-vigilant scanning of exits and other patrons that had become my own automatic behavior. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, after brief introductions. "I've wanted to contact you since I learned about the files, but the FBI advised against it until certain investigations were completed. You were one of the potential targets," I said, watching her expression for confirmation. She nodded. "Category 3 acquisition candidate, according to their classification system. Preliminary surveillance completed, but not yet moved to active targeting when the arrests occurred." The clinical terminology sounded strange, coming from a potential victim, rather than the predators who had created it. Jennifer noted my reaction with a sad smile. "I've spent 2 years studying everything about them," she explained. "Their methodology, selection criteria, operational patterns. Understanding the system that almost consumed me helps me feel some control over what happened." Her words resonated deeply. My own research and consulting work served similar purposes, transforming victim experience into educational framework, passive terror into active knowledge. "How many others have you contacted?" I asked. "You're the 4th, she replied. There were 17 women identified from the files, who could be located and notified. Most wanted no further involvement after the initial FBI contact, which I completely understand. But you want something more," I observed. "I want to create an educational program," Jennifer said, leaning forward intently. "Not just standard stranger danger warnings, but specific information about sophisticated predator methodologies, how they select targets, how they test boundaries, how they create scenarios designed to exploit helpful instincts." The concept immediately resonated with my own evolving perspective. Not just survival and recovery, but prevention through education. Not just personal security, but systemic awareness. Most safety advice focuses on obvious threats, Jennifer continued. The stranger in the dark alley, the visibly aggressive approach. But Reynolds and Shelton weren't obvious. They were methodical, patient, psychologically sophisticated. People like them count on social conditioning, I added, thinking of how my ingrained politeness had overridden my initial hesitation on Route 16, on our reluctance to seem rude or paranoid. Exactly. We need to teach recognition of testing, behaviors, subtle boundary violations, manufactured scenarios designed to assess helper response. By the end of our lunch, we had outlined a framework for what would eventually become the Recognition and Resistance Education Program, focusing on sophisticated predator methodology, identification rather than simplistic avoidance techniques. What began as a small workshop expanded over the next year, supported by law enforcement agencies who recognize the value of prevention-focused education. Jennifer's background in instructional design complemented my classroom experience and first-hand knowledge, creating a program that balanced practical security awareness with psychological resilience. We never used our personal stories directly in the materials, maintaining privacy while leveraging our experiences to identify critical warning indicators. The program focused on specific behavioral patterns rather than creating generalized fear, teaching recognition of testing scenarios and manufactured situations designed to assess victim suitability. The helper test, I explained during one training session for college students, a situation created to evaluate your response to someone apparently needing assistance, someone struggling with packages, a confused person needing directions, a disabled vehicle on an isolated road. The example hit close to home, but that was precisely the point. Transforming my trauma into educational framework gave it purpose beyond personal suffering. What I didn't know then was that our program had attracted attention beyond its intended audience, that certain online forums associated with the network had identified our educational materials as operational security concerns, requiring methodological adjustment. That new testing scenarios were being developed specifically to circumvent the warning signs we were teaching people to recognize. That my increased public visibility through the educational program was simultaneously providing protection through awareness while creating new vulnerability through exposure. That in a digital file somewhere, my status had been updated from compromised acquisition target to countermeasure developer requiring specialized monitoring. The education program expanded, reaching thousands of students, professional organizations, and community groups, lives potentially saved through awareness, trauma transformed into prevention, all while the underlying threat evolved in response, adapting like any predatory system to changing awareness among potential prey. 5 years after Route 16, I began noticing the pattern. Small discrepancies in my carefully maintained security systems. The front door deadbolt, locked in a slightly different position than I had left it. Items on my desk, rearranged by millimeters. The shower curtain, hanging at a subtly different angle. Changes so minor, they might be attributed to memory lapses, drafts, or normal household settling. Changes I might not have noticed before Route 16. Rewired my brain for hypervigilance. Changes that occurred despite multiple security systems showing no evidence of intrusion. I documented everything meticulously, photographing rooms before leaving and comparing upon return, placing nearly invisible markers that would be disturbed by movement, installing secondary surveillance systems beyond the obvious security cameras. After 3 weeks of documentation, I presented the evidence to Detective Ramirez, now Lieutenant Ramirez, heading the Special Victims Intelligence Unit. It could be hypervigilance creating false positives, she said, studying my photographs and notes. The brain seeking patterns where none exist. Or it could be someone deliberately creating doubt, I countered, making changes small enough to question my own perception. Gaslighting is psychological warfare. Ramirez didn't dismiss the possibility. She had seen enough of the network's methodology to recognize their psychological sophistication. Will increase technical surveillance, she decided, and add periodic physical checks from patrol units. But Olivia, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. We need to consider the possibility that this is PTSD manifesting in new patterns. I understood her perspective. 5 years had passed. The primary suspects remained incarcerated. Investigations into the wider network had stalled without new evidence. From an official standpoint, the case had cooled to monitoring status rather than active threat assessment. The security upgrades detected nothing in the following weeks. No unauthorized entry, no surveillance devices, no evidence supporting my perception of subtle environmental changes. Yet the discrepancies continued. Books on my shelf rearranged by centimeters, kitchen items in slightly different positions than I had left them, the distinct feeling of spaces being occupied in my absence. Then came the email. No subject line. No sender information beyond an encrypted address. Just 3 words in the body. Statistical anomalies persist. I forwarded it immediately to Ramirez, who initiated trace attempts while ordering increased physical security at my apartment. Technical analysis revealed sophisticated routing through multiple servers. Origin untraceable, beyond confirming it hadn't come from any of the incarcerated network members. This changes the threat assessment, Ramirez acknowledged after reviewing the cybersecurity report. The phrasing matches their operational language patterns too specifically to be coincidence or copycat. The implied conclusion hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. Someone connected to the network was still watching me, still focused on my case specifically, rather than general operational concerns. The apartment isn't safe, I stated flatly. Hasn't been for weeks, possibly longer. Ramirez nodded grimly. We'll arrange secure temporary housing while conducting comprehensive sweep operations. I relocated that night to a police-secured hotel room, bringing only essential items packed under observation to ensure no tracking devices were inadvertently transferred. The technical team's search of my apartment revealed nothing initially. No conventional surveillance devices, no signs of forced entry, no evidence explaining how someone could have repeatedly accessed the space despite multiple security systems. On the second day of searching, they found it, not an electronic device, but something far more concerning, a key matching my front door lock, hidden within the smoke detector in the hallway outside my apartment. A detector maintained by the building management, providing legitimate access for battery changes and testing. Forensic analysis identified partial fingerprints belonging to the building's maintenance supervisor, Vincent Calloway. Background investigation revealed nothing suspicious in his history, no connections to known network members, no criminal record beyond a decade-old DUI. When questioned, Calloway claimed no knowledge of the key beyond normal maintenance operations, claimed he had never entered my apartment without prior notification and work orders, claimed complete ignorance of any security concerns related to my history. Polygraph results were inconclusive. Financial records showed no unusual transactions. Digital forensics found no connections to known network communication channels. Either he's uninvolved, or he's been exceptionally well managed as an access point. Ramirez concluded, after reviewing all evidence, we can't hold him without more substantial connections. The building owner terminated Calloway's employment, regardless, replacing all potentially compromised locks and upgrading security systems throughout the property. I remained in temporary housing during these changes, uncertainty having eroded any sense of residential safety. What I didn't know then was that Vincent Calloway would be found dead 3 weeks later, an apparent suicide with prescription medication and alcohol. That forensic examination would reveal subtle anomalies, suggesting staged suicide rather than genuine self-harm. That partial DNA evidence would be recovered, showing potential contact with persons unknown shortly before his death. That investigations into his background would eventually uncover a connection to a private security firm linked to 3 other maintenance workers at properties housing women identified in Shelton's files. That the network's methodology had evolved to include legitimate service providers as unwitting access facilitators, sometimes without their knowledge, sometimes through minor compensation for special maintenance requests from fictional management companies. That my hypervigilance hadn't been creating false positives, but had instead detected genuine intrusion so sophisticated it nearly escaped professional security investigation. That somewhere in a digital file, my status had been updated again. Countermeasure developer with enhanced security awareness requiring specialized circumvention protocols. The pattern had been real all along. 7 years after Route 16, I live in a house I designed myself, built on land purchased through a trust to obscure ownership records. The security systems would impress military installations. The sightlines allow no approach without detection. The property perimeter features natural barriers, supplemented by technological monitoring. My mother passed away last year, releasing me from the predictable patterns of care facility visits that had created vulnerability through routine. James retired from military service and lives 30 minutes away, close enough for regular contact, but maintaining operational security through separation. I still teach, though at a different school, under modified credentials, supported by official documentation. My students know me as Ms. Kennedy, English Literature and Creative Writing. My hypervigilance appears to them as merely the eccentricity of a private person with particular habits. The recognition and resistance education program continues its expansion, now implemented in curriculum across 12 states. Jennifer Larson handles most public appearances. My direct involvement limited to content development and remote consultation to maintain security protocols. Ramirez, now Captain Ramirez, heading the Regional Predatory Crimes Task Force, maintains regular contact through secure channels. The official investigation remains open but inactive without new evidence. Classified as monitoring status with periodic review. No confirmed network activities. Targeting program-connected individuals in 28 months. Her most recent update reported. Continued surveillance reveals no patterns suggesting operational interest in your current location or identity. Security assessments suggest I'm no longer an active acquisition target, that my visibility through the education program combined with enhanced security measures makes me a suboptimal resource investment. According to their operational terminology, that the network focuses on candidates requiring less specialized methodology and resource allocation. I understand these assessments intellectually while maintaining practical security regardless. Continue varying routes and routines. Continue checking vehicles before entering. Continue monitoring environmental indicators for unauthorized access. Continue living in the intersection between vigilance and functionality. The stain on my backseat has faded further with time, barely visible, now except in certain light. I finally sold the Honda 3 years ago, transferring the emergency hammer to my new vehicle as a talisman, connecting past to present, vulnerability to survival. Most days pass without conscious fear dominating my thoughts. I teach my classes, develop program materials, maintain connections with the small circle of people who know both my past and present identities. I function within the parameters of my new normal. The hypervigilance integrated so completely, it rarely registers as a separate from ordinary perception. Then something triggers the memory. Car with hazard lights on a rainy night. A man asking for directions, with too much knowledge of my destination. A subtle change in a room. I know I left differently. The chemical smell of certain cleaning products that recalls the compound Reynolds used. In those moments, the 7 years collapse into immediacy. The terror returns with physical intensity. Heart racing, skin cold, muscles tensed for flight or fight. The aftermath asserting itself against time's passage. Trauma embedded too deeply for complete resolution. What I've learned is that some experiences permanently alter perception. Some threats create vigilance that never fully recedes. Some violations transform normalcy into perpetual awareness of vulnerability beneath ordinary surfaces. I received an email last month from an address I didn't recognize. Subject line empty. Body containing only a photograph of a red stain on car upholstery. The image manipulated to prevent metadata tracking. After security protocols and investigation, technical analysis determined it was an image captured from an early news report about my case, digitally altered and recirculated rather than a new photograph. Not direct targeting, but rather what Ramirez called generalized intimidation testing. Potentially automated rather than specifically directed. Still, it achieved its apparent purpose. Reminded me that somewhere in digital spaces I cannot access, my file likely remains active. That the network, though disrupted by arrests and exposure, continues its evolution beneath detection thresholds. That methodology refinement proceeds in response to countermeasures like our education program. I don't know if I'll ever be truly free of the aftermath, if hypervigilance will ever fully integrate into background processing rather than conscious attention, if the statistical anomaly of my survival will ever become simply my life rather than an ongoing case study in both personal resilience and predatory methodology. What I do know is that I'm not simply a survivor of what happened on Route 16. I'm the unintended consequence of their methodology, the statistical anomaly, whose existence exposed operational vulnerabilities in their system. The education program reaches thousands, potentially disrupting acquisition patterns by teaching recognition of testing behaviors and manufactured scenarios. Reynolds intended to take my life. Instead, his actions gave my life purpose beyond what existed before. Not healing through time's passage, but transformation through aftermath's integration. Not recovery to previous state, but evolution into something strengthened by traumas. Lessons. The red stain fades, but never disappears completely. The vigilance fluctuates, but never vanishes entirely. The aftermath continues its gradual evolution from fresh wound to permanent adaptation. I still check my backseat before entering my car, still vary my routes home, still maintain awareness of exit strategies in any space I enter. And somewhere, someone might still have my file, might still consider me unfinished business, despite risk assessment modifications, might still maintain surveillance beyond detection capabilities, waiting for vulnerability indicators to justify resource allocation for specialized methodology implementation. The aftermath has no conclusion, only continuing vigilance against its potential evolution from memory into renewed present tense. The horror persists in possibility, if not immediate reality, and the stain remains visible in certain light.